2 months after 20 school children and 6 adults are gunned down at Sandy Hook Elementary School, a national conversation about gun control rages on. How can we prevent another mass shooting? But some communities face a relentless reality of gun violence every day.
Please, please, stop killing our babies.
Bay Area residents demand action.
Stop the silence, to stop the violence, gotta say something. Say something. Do something. Do something.
What are the effects and how can it be stopped? Plus, Oakland's controversial new police consultant, Bill Bratton, as he prepares to tackle violence on the streets. Coming up next. Good evening and welcome to a special edition of This Week in Northern California. I'm Jamie Floyd. The shootings at Sandy Hook have sparked a new national dialogue about guns. PBS has dedicated much of this week's programming to exploring the alarming rise of gun violence around the country, and especially to so-called rampage killings. Yet in many urban communities, some right here in Northern California, people live with pervasive gun violence on a daily basis. Tonight, we devote our full program to the topic of gun violence here in the Bay Area. Later, we'll hear from a panel of experts. But first, a group of citizens fed up with the violence are pleading to be heard. Their story was reported in collaboration with students from the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism.
What do we want? Peace. And when do we want it?
Yeah. Every Saturday morning, a group of Oakland residents gathers at the site of a recent murder to protest gun violence in their city.
Stop the silence, to stop the violence, gotta say something. Say something. Do something. Do something.
They call themselves SAVE, an acronym for Soldiers Against Violence Everywhere.
We are soldiers. We're out here in the rain, cold, doing what we do.
SAVE was started in 2010 by the pastor at Oakland's True Vine Ministries Church after a member of his congregation was shot and killed.
We sort of took a page from the civil rights movement where they would go to the lunch counters and sit in until they were arrested. So we do stand-ins. We go to the community where someone has been murdered, and we go and protest in the community about the violence.
We are here to support you, let you know that your grandson will never be forgotten.
I'm here today to support my grandson, Aaron Marks, that was killed last month, actually on November the 24th. So I'm here to support him, to let everyone know that he did have a family. These are our babies. Please put these guns away.
Julia Ford's grandson was one of Oakland's 131 homicide victims in 2012. Though murder rates have been dropping steadily nationwide, Oakland saw a 20% spike in homicides last year. This has prompted citizen outrage.
Hey, Oakland is no different than any other city. People go to work every day. The only difference is that at any given moment, they can be caught in crossfire. That has to stop. That has to stop. And we pay our taxes to be protected, and we want protection.
As Oakland residents demand action, the city police force has suffered years of cutbacks and now has 25% fewer officers compared to 5 years ago. Meanwhile, the department continues to work to meet decade-old court-ordered reforms. The OPD has turned to William Bratton, a former police chief who is often credited with reducing crime in Los Angeles and New York. But some civil rights groups are critical of his tactics. He will make his first official boots on the ground visit to Oakland early next month. The city retained him as part of a $250,000 contract with his consulting firm. Earlier today, I spoke with Bill Bratton. He says he needs to assess the situation firsthand before offering any specific prescriptions for Oakland. But there are lessons to be learned from other cities. He joined us from New York. William Bratton, thank you so much for coming in and to talk with us today. As you know, the last time America had a very serious gun control debate was in the early 1990s. Of course, you were chief of police in the New York City area, and that was followed by a 2 decades decline in crime. And so I was hoping we could begin by having you put that decline in crime in context.
The investment in the 90s was 100,000 additional police were hired. Additional money went into research, into prisons, into rehabilitation efforts. Research was critical. There was the assault weapons ban on certain types of assault weapons. The impact of that particular piece of the legislation is still being debated. Some studies indicate it had an impact, some studies indicated it did not. From my own perspective, I look at every life saved is a plus. Every incident that didn't occur is a plus. It is quite clear that hundreds of thousands of individuals who did not get access to those type weapons, that clearly there would have been incidents that would have occurred with those weapons but for that intervention.
What is your feeling about what President Obama has proposed?
The new initiative by the president has a number of elements. One is a significant expansion of the requirement for background screening. Right now, 40% of the weapons purchased in the United States are bought at gun shows. Congress deliberately excluded them from the background check provision. And so many of the guns, I believe the majority of guns used in crimes today, many of them come from that one particular source. So closing that loophole would go a long way toward reducing illegal firearms or firearms of any type in the hands of the criminal population. Second initiative is the idea of changing the magazine clips that fit into many of these weapons so that they can only hold a certain number of rounds, as yet undetermined. I think that would be beneficial because an individual has to change a clip during the course of one of these mass shootings. That presents an opportunity to interrupt that behavior. A third initiative that is being made is, once again, a ban on assault weapons. I happen to think that one is not likely to pass. It's unfortunate, but I just don't think, despite all the rhetoric, it's going to pass. The fourth one, which is very important also, is additional efforts dealing with the mentally ill. That in so many of these instances, it is quite clear that the shooters, if you will, are dealing with significant mental issues, mental incapacity, and there's so much more that we can do in dealing with that particular part of the population. We can do a much better job preventing people from getting guns, whether mentally incapacitated or criminals from getting easy access through gun shows. And then on the reactive side, we also have the ability, if you commit a crime with a gun, and you're not significantly mentally incapacitated, where you're going to go off to a mental facility, you go to jail. You go to jail for a significant period of time. That's what worked in the 90s and continuing in the 21st century in the significant reduction in crime. We focused on prevention and focused on those who were committing the crimes.
So that leads me to the question I must ask about stop and frisk. And I think you prefer stop, question, and frisk.
I was just going to correct you there, young lady, on that. Everybody likes to leave out the middle part of that. It's a three-part process.
Say why you think so. And I know you don't want to speak specifically about Oakland, but in most urban centers, there's some tension on stop and frisk. How do you address that concern, and why do you think it's a policy that works, an applicable tool?
It is a constitutionally protected activity by police. Challenge for police is to do it legally, compassionately, consistently, not just in poor neighborhoods, not just in minority neighborhoods. And that is the issue, unfortunately, around the country, because that's where it is most frequently used, because unfortunately, that is where the majority of crime, both serious and minor, is committed. That's the reality of our lives, our society. It is an essential tool of policing. Can police be better trained, supervised, and monitored? I think they can. But those that are advocating that it be done away with or representing that it can be done away with, I'm sorry that you do away with it and you're going to have your cities overrun with crime because it is the basic tool that every police department in America uses.
When you come into a major metropolitan area to consult, what are you looking for? What do you take stock of when you assess a situation, a crisis situation like the one that city officials are facing?
I won't speak to the Oakland situation. That not been there yet. In the case of consultancies, you're usually brought in to do a specific assignment. So depending on what the individual city's issues are, and in my case as a consultant, what they're looking for us to do, it's all about diagnosing the illness and then taking your experience, what's worked elsewhere that might be applicable for your particular client or patient. This stuff is not rocket science. This is, for 40 years I've been doing it, and I think for 40 years pretty successfully. And that's good news because it is replicable, it is transferable, it is modifiable.
All right, well, William Bratton, we thank you very much for your time, and we wish you all the best in Oakland.
Jamie, great to be with you. All the best.
And now to our panel. Joining me tonight are Drrisco Smith, Director of the Center for the Vulnerable Child at Children's Hospital in Oakland, Eva Patterson, President and founder of Equal Justice Society, and journalist Mina Kim from KQED's California Report. And Mina, I want to start with you because you've been in the trenches reporting on this issue, and Bill Bratton has been in New York, Los Angeles, Boston as commissioner, but not in Oakland. He's had a lot of success in those cities bringing down the crime rate, so that's a hopeful sign. But what challenges, in your experience with your reporting, will he face as he works with Chief Jordan in Oakland?
Well, I think his biggest challenge is that he's going to be a lightning rod for the community. He's already shown himself to be that because of his support and his use of stop and frisk. And I'm not sure that his very strong defense of stop and frisk that we just heard in the interview will go over well with community members who are concerned about the racial profiling that might occur if stop and frisk is used. Now, already Chief Jordan has said that that will not be implemented and that Bill Bratton will have a limited role. But Bill Bratton will be facing other challenges besides having a limited role. And one is the fact that he's also dealing with a city that's had a big spike in violent crime,
yes,
that's lost a couple hundred police officers in the last few years, and that's being scrutinized by the federal court.
Let's talk a little more about what you've seen in Oakland. The reduction in the police force, although reporting recently that there will be additions made to the force in Oakland and elsewhere in Northern California. But you've dug really deeply into this issue and written extensively about and reported extensively on the California Report about Oakland residents pleading for officials to pay attention to killings in Oakland. Say more about that. Say more about what's happening on the streets in the Oakland community.
What I found is that folks in Oakland feel like they're under siege. And I think they're really hopeful that the attention that's being paid to gun violence after Newtown will help to bring more attention. And the group that we profiled at the very beginning, SAVE, is also a group that I spoke with. And one of the things that they're trying to do, besides just trying to get more attention, is also to try to jolt their own community out of an exhaustion and a sense of numbness from dealing with all of these shootings all the time. Because in that numbness, while it's certainly an understandable response to constant shootings, it creates a lack of action. And they want to see more action from the ground up, from the community up. And so that's one thing that I'm seeing. The other thing is I'm hearing frustration about it constantly being pegged as gang-related killings, because what the community is experiencing are grandmothers dying, are their babies dying. And so to keep calling it gang related to them, I think sounds like it's a way for community leaders or for the city leaders or for state leaders to act like they have some control over the situation, as opposed to really addressing the situation the way the community is experiencing it, which is innocent people being killed.
And to get the media to respond in an appropriate fashion.
Right, I think they'd like to see that change too.
Eva Patterson, let me turn to you. Why are you so passionate about this issue? Is it personal? Is it political? Both? And what's your response when you hear that Bill Bratton is coming in to consult in Oakland, as he has in many other places, Detroit? We know he's been a commissioner in 3 major urban centers with some success. As an Oakland resident, as someone who is the founder of the Equal Justice Society, what's your response? Personal, political, both, and why?
I have a range of responses. I was having dinner with a very close friend of mine who's a philanthropist in Oakland, and we were just lamenting the fact that this is just going on and on and on. When I watch those parents, I wonder, and I have to put this on myself, where are people like me? You know, I'm a civil rights lawyer, I live in Oakland, why am I not trying to figure out some answer to this? Where are the corporate leaders of Oakland? Why is it just left to the moms and dads on the street?
And the preachers.
Exactly, and thank God for them. I also am very nervous about Bill Bratton. Stop and frisk generally results in people of color being stopped. There's a prominent lawyer who you probably know who lives in Oakland. He was stopped in the driveway of his home and was stopped by the Oakland police. Now, we don't want to malign the police. We all need protection. But what happens is that certain stereotypes about men of color come into play, and it affects who's stopped. And that's what's very unnerving. There's an epidemic of an over-incarceration of black and brown people. It starts with stop and frisk. An activity that might be seen as a harmless activity if engaged in by a white kid, if it's a black or brown kid, they're going to juvie. A white kid may be sent home. Don't do that again. And it starts this school to prison pipeline. It just starts a whole array of problems. So stop and frisk, I think, is really problematic. In Los Angeles, I believe there was a code called NHI. It meant no human involved. This was a police code, which meant black and brown people. The work we've done on brain science and behavioral science seems to indicate that many people associate criminality with black people and brown people. So having the stop and frisk as a way to deal with this, I think, is an overreaction and is a way that we might just cause more harm.
Very concerning. I want to come back to the brain science when we talk solutions in just a moment, but I want to turn now to you, Dr. Drrisco Smith, for more of the real world impact on this, because, and I know you as well, Mina, have looked at this as a health issue. This is a health issue, isn't it? A public health issue.
Right. It's a public health issue that has broad ramifications for how people are doing and functioning. And even to take it back to the health implications in the brain science, we have lots of evidence that being exposed to this level of chronic trauma really impacts people's functionings and their brain. And
how so? What does it do to a community to be under siege? Picking up on what Mina said earlier, over time, this level of violence and the number of deaths in a community, and it's not just Oakland, we could name a number of communities in the Bay Area and across the country that are under siege. And so we see a Sandy Hook and we see a number of deaths, 20 children, 6 adults, plus the killer and his mother. But over time, we see a volume of deaths in a single community. That must have an impact on the psyche of the people who live in that community.
It has an impact on the psyche of the community, and it has an impact on the bodies and minds of those that live in the community as well. So there's robust research to really document that living in circumstances of chronic trauma will actually impact brain development and potential for health development, and also have impacts in terms of cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes. I mean, there are a number of impacts that are really documented.
There's research to support that.
To support that being exposed to chronic levels of trauma does that. And there's, actually was on the phone on the way here with a researcher from San Francisco Veterans Administration looking into some of that work. The animal models are there, and unfortunately the people models are there too. It's chronic stress is another way of kind of thinking about it. When one has to always be worried about whether or not you're going to be harmed, it impacts the body.
So give us a real world example. I mean, what do you see in your practice? Who are the people we're talking about? You know, there is, as Mina suggests, this notion that we're talking about gang violence, and often we are, and not that those lives should be discounted either. But what do you see? You're working with children often, or young people, juveniles, but it's not just the victim that's affected.
No, not just the victim, but the family around them. So we work with many children at Children's Hospital with children in foster care. So we have a program that specializes in kids 0 to 3. Now those are kids 0 to 3 that are exposed to chronic trauma around them, also within their families, but also many of the folks that we serve have been witness to this type of violence or actually direct victims. And what we see is developmental regression, a lack of progression. We see parents unable to meet the needs of the children because they're so highly traumatized. We see children and infants that are actually stiff and unable to respond. We see really day to day that there's a dramatic impact impact. There's also a dramatic impact of being able to help and to intervene and to call folks together. But I think, as Mina describes before, the numbness, hypervigilance, feelings of no future are all kind of characteristics of being highly traumatized as a community.
And at the same time, Eva, I don't want to pathologize any community. This is not unique to Oakland.
No.
This is not unique to any community in Northern California, Richmond, Emeryville. This is a problem in many communities across the country. And it is a systemic problem, is it not?
It is. And I was also really resonating with what you said. My fiance was murdered. I am an upper income professional. This was 16 years ago. I'm still dealing psychologically with the impact.
Gun violence, Eva?
He was shot in the head in Kingston, Jamaica.
So
Well, I
sorry.
wasn't there. And I'm still dealing with that. And I've had therapy, but if I'm in East Oakland and this is happening every day, and I'm 6 years old, you and I were talking about the children. Do you want to tell that story about the kids who were going to the library?
Right, the children who were walking to the library and then couldn't go because there was a shootout by their school, and then they were on lockdown, and then they had to go the next day with a police escort. But the kids were very aware that they are in a situation of violence. They are very much aware of what's going on around them, and it's hard to see little kids reflecting that back to you.
And we cannot have a conversation that is solely about the problem. I want to talk about the solution. So let's go around with a panel of women who are so committed to these issues. Let me start, Mina, with you, because you've talked to some people about solutions in your reporting. What have you found?
Well, I've talked to both physicians and also with the community. So to begin with, some of the public health officials I talked to, they felt like applying certain awareness campaigns that were effective with other public health issues, like drunk driving, for example, when they raised awareness that it's okay to intervene if someone is drunk and about to get behind the wheel. They're saying it's okay to intervene if somebody is going through a bad patch and they have access to a gun. Go in there and say, hey, you know, let's get the gun out of the house for a while, because what they're trying to talk about is not just gun homicides, but also gun suicides, because gun suicides can lead to homicides. I mean, arguably, the event in Newtown, he could have been suicidal and taking out as many people as he could before he took himself. And so they're talking about that kind of avoidance. And if there's a way to actually, you know, make people feel like that is an allowable or reasonable and a publicly supported intervention, then that could help reduce people's access to guns when they're going through a bad patch.
Eva, solutions?
I want to go back to the kids, because we were all just torn up about the kids at Sandy Hook and also the kids who were survivors. And everyone was sad, and that was a good thing. But think of the kids you were just talking about who go through this every day. What are we doing for them? So maybe you do this at your hospital, but I think some type of therapy, psychological support, not just for the kids, but for the parents. In my discussions this week about this topic with people in Oakland, people said people aren't getting educated. So you can't get a job. One good way to make money is to sell drugs. If you're selling drugs, you're going to come into violence because things are really crazy. And so there's this chain reaction. And then the last thing is what I talked about before. Why am I not meeting with those parents on the street in Oakland? Why isn't the head of Clorox not meeting with them? Why aren't we feeling like a community of Oakland rather than, oh, isn't it terrible what's going on? I have some responsibility as well. I think many of us do, and maybe this show will be a catalyst for having that kind of conversation. But we're some smart people in Oakland. I need to know you. I need to work with you. I need to connect with you. I know you.
And in Richmond, and in San Jose, and in Emeryville, and in all places, and in places that perhaps aren't under siege, reaching across the border to places that are. Doctor, your solutions?
I think there are actually a number of solutions that are available. And, you know, as much as we have research about the negative impact, we also have lots of research that there are things that work. There are trauma-informed and evidence-based therapies that are available that we provide at Children's, that a number of folks provide throughout the East Bay. And there's also folks that are up in arms, the folks that are kind of coalescing and doing work. I think the work that's done at some of the high schools, the youth empowerment, youth uprising, there's a number of folks that are really getting folks together, getting the youth together to really stop, because they feel this impact in ways that, you know, many people don't. They are seeing their friends and their community be torn apart, and there's an uprising. And I think there's a means of actually interrupting on this pipeline. You articulated a pipeline, which I think is true, a pipeline that goes into the prison industrial complex, a pipeline that actually moves Black and brown out of the way. But there's a way to interrupt that.
And once you're in that pipeline,
very hard
to break out.
Very, and the systems that are involved. So whether it's a juvenile justice or a foster care or those kinds of systems. But I think there are ways of interrupting that system before. I think there's education and attention, support for parents. And I think there's actually a lot of work that's going on and a lot of hopefulness because we're under so much despair and so much rage. But I think that's actually something that we can kind of motivate to interrupt this cycle. But there are things that can be done.
I mean, one of the things I was hearing about actually is as simple as people are getting to know their neighbors. They're connecting with them. There's been a growth in neighborhood watch programs, but there's also just been growth in people using social media and other ways of connecting with each other so that they can actually, come together and protect their communities.
And less isolation, I think, is the key. And I think perhaps in the media we can do more to help people be aware of this isolation that has occurred.
Yes.
And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to help, perhaps as you suggested, spark a conversation about what's happening in our communities. And as you say, perhaps Sandy Hook can, as it seems to have in our country, start this conversation about what's happening in neighborhoods every day across our country. Thank you, ladies, all so much for being here. And that's all for tonight, but the conversation does continue online. You can visit kqed.org/thisweek for our interactive map of Oakland. It details the thousands of gun-related crimes reported in 2012. There's also a link to the PBS series After Newtown and much more. I'm Jamie Floyd. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.